to our lecture on Chapter 18, Blood. So, you're going to be able to list the functions of blood and identify the components of blood and explain what is found in each component. So what are the parts of blood? Cells. Okay, what kind of cells? Red cells. Okay, what else? White blood cells. Anything else? Urea. Yeah. Oxygen. CO2. What else is in blood? Glucose. What's most of blood? What's 55% of blood? Or about 50%, I guess. Water. So, what is all this stuff doing in blood? What does blood do? It transports. What does it transport? Oxygen, nutrients, waste products. So it transports oxygen. It transports nutrients such as low-density lipoprotein, glucose, and amino acids, and waste products such as CO2 and urea. So blood is a fluid connective tissue. It is made up of something called formed elements, which are the blood cells. And it has a matrix like all connective tissues. So where are the proteins in blood if it's a connective tissue? So I have a whole blood sample here. And if I were to centrifuge it, which is fancy for saying spinning real fast, I would get two components. Roughly 45% is cells, which are the formed elements, and roughly 55 to 56% is something called plasma, which is the matrix. So this top part here is the plasma, and this bottom part here is the formed elements. And most of these are red blood cells, which are erythrocytes. Now, allegedly, there's a small layer on top of the formed elements. I honestly have never seen it, and I have centrifuged a lot of blood samples, but I also wasn't paying that much attention to it. This small layer is called the Buffy coat. Think of your favorite vampire slayer, Buffy, putting on a jacket or a coat to protect her blood from the plasma or the vampires. So, we'll talk about what's in this plasma and what's in this formed elements later, though. But the Buffy coat is white blood cells and platelets. So over here on our picture, we have the plasma, and then the formed elements are sort of going down below the frame. Now, blood is about 7% of your body weight, and men tend to have more because of this hormone called testosterone. Now, the range. Range goes from a scarlet red, which is this one, to a dull red, which is this one. Now this is oxygenated, or oxygen rich. So this is oxygen bound to it as this nice bright red. When I was in graduate school, I had to draw blood from experimental animals, and I actually drew it from a catheter. So a couple drops of blood would always drip out, and they would drip onto this black countertop. It would turn this scarlet color in a second. Now, the blood in my tubes was this color. This is a dull red, which is oxygen poor. And that's because oxygen is not bound to hemoglobin. So the oxygen in your veins is not blue. It is this dull red color. Veins look blue because of the connective tissue around them. And when the cadaver, they actually do look a little blue. And then you're also looking through the skin. So the blood in your veins is not blue, even though the veins look a little bluish. Now the pH range is 7.35, which is in your veins, and 7.45, which is in your arteries. And that's slightly on the basic side. If you get more acidic than this, let's say 7.1, you get into a big heap of trouble. You might go into a coma and die. Well, let's go the other direction. Let's say 7.6. You'll go through spasms and die. So basically, if you get outside of this range by even a little bit, you're in big trouble. And the temperature range, it's higher than body temperature. You control heat and temperature by where your blood goes. On cold days, all your blood stays in your core. You don't send it to your arms and your legs. So on cold days, a pulse on the wrist is not a good sign of actual heart rate because it doesn't have as much blood flow. Now, on hot days, you will dilate your veins and you can see them very clearly because you're trying to dump heat. Now, as I said on the other board page, if you centrifuge blood, here's a centrifuge. Components. You get the formed elements right here, which are blood cells. Most of them are these cells called erythrocytes. That is a fancy name for red blood cell. Erythro is red. White blood cells really are white. In physiology, you get to have a lot of fun and count actual white blood cells that are not stained. Have fun. And those play a role in defense. And then thrombocytes is a fancy way to say platelet. Now, plasma floats on top of it. It's mostly water, but it has other very important substances in it, which we'll talk about. So here's somebody taking a blood sample, and they're centrifuging it. And they're getting this sample right here, which is formed elements. Most of this is going to be red blood cells. So all of that is the red blood cells, called erythrocytes. Now, between the erythrocytes and the plasma, this layer right here, right there, is called the Buffy coat. Not for my favorite vampire slayer. And this coat is on top of the erythrocytes, and this is the leukocytes, the white blood cells, and the thrombocytes. So, you need to know what is found in each thing. Now, if I ask you what are the two components of blood, I want formed elements and plasma. If I asked you what is in the formed elements when you centrifuge, I want erythrocytes and Buffy coat. So erythrocytes are red blood cells, and they're red even without a stain. Now there are these cute biconcave discs. There's the pictures over here now. And this is to increase surface area, because their only job is to transport oxygen. And an increased surface area increases the rate of diffusion. White blood cells are called leukocytes. Now, that's a leukocyte right there. That's a leukocyte. That's a leukocyte. That's a leukocyte. And that's a leukocyte. Those don't look white. If you actually took an unstained sample of blood, you would see they are really white. Physiology students get frustrated because they have to count them. They get really frustrated because it's really hard to see them when you're trying to count them. Then platelets are fragments. I can see some platelets, like there's some platelets. That might be a platelet. I think that's a watermark. So there are these little tiny fragments, and they help with blood clotting. So on the test, you need to know the general function, and then we'll talk about that's an eosinophil, that's a neutrophil. Wow, this is a Photoshop picture with those all together. Sorry, my picture's not that exciting on this page. There's over 100 different molecules in plasma. That is according to your textbook. Don't worry, you don't have to know all 100, only 97 or so. Now, most of it's water. That remaining 5 to 10% has nutrients, such as glucose, vitamins, minerals, fat in the form of low-density lipoprotein, and amino acids. It has salts. Guess I shouldn't put minerals as salts. That's like sodium, potassium, very little potassium though, chloride, and calcium. Respiratory gases, O2 and CO2. But most of this is bound up in hemoglobin. Most of this is actually bound up in something called bicarbonate. Hormones, remember 2 chapters ago, or I guess last chapter. Plasma proteins. Oh, look, there's a bunch of proteins we need to talk about. And waste products. So let's talk about those proteins. There's 3 main plasma proteins I want you to learn. Albumin. These are your simple squamosal cells lining your blood vessels. So that's how small the cell is. This is albumin. It makes up 60% of your blood proteins, and its job is to be a large protein. What happens is it's a solute, and water likes to follow solutes, like sodium, like glucose. So it likes following albumin, and since it can't leave your blood vessels, the plasma, the water portion of plasma, also doesn't want to leave. It gets forced out in your capillary beds, but the albumin is going to draw it back in. Fibrinogen is also a humongous protein. Not what fibrinogen looks like, by the way. I just drew lines with Microsoft Paint. And it helps with blood clotting. So this is the protein fibers in the matrix. You only see it when there's a blood clot. Then you have globulins. Alpha globulins transport steroid hormones. Gamma globulins are something called antibodies. They help with defense. And I threw in HDL and LDL here. That's L and that's H. Because it's a lipoprotein. So, which is not a formed element? Albumin, thrombocytes, leukocytes, or erythrocytes? Well, since these have sites, erythrocytes are red blood cells, they transport oxygen. Leukocytes are white blood cells, they defend you. Thrombocytes have site in it too. Those are platelets, they help with clotting. It must be albumin. So what does albumin do? Oops. Which blood protein helps keep fluid in the blood? Transferrin, we've never heard, but I think it transfers whatever ferrin is. That's iron, by the way. Alpha globulins is steroids. That's clotting. So it must be albumin.